This video is a brief introduction to the ideas and an overview of the format for my dissertation. Please note that this is dated the 10th of February 2021 at approximately 4 p.m. and so subsequent discussions and emerging themes may modify this format or the particulars presented here. So an overview of the dissertation structure and ideas. In a traditional dissertation, chapters 1 through 3 form the proposal, with chapter 1 being the introduction to the topic, chapter 2 being an extensive review of the literature, and chapter 3 detailing the methods used in the subsequent dissertation project. The dissertation that is submitted and defended then adds chapters 4, analyzing the results of the methods that collected the data, and chapter 5, discussing and concluding major thoughts and themes that emerged from that dissertation process. That is a very linear, traditional format. However, what I am proposing to do is apply a framework used by the hard sciences more frequently, in which rather than a omnibus introduction, literature review, and methods, each as separate chapters, Chapter 1 is more of an introduction and overview of the literature, contextualizing the entire project without going into specifics for each of the research questions addressed. And that'll make more sense in just a moment. So you have that brief introduction and overarching literature review, and then a chapter on the methodological foundations of the dissertation project. It does not go into specifics about the variables selected, the data sources, or any of those kinds of nuances, because, again, that is saved for the following chapter 3. Chapter 3, then, is a series of individual papers of publishable quality or having already been published, depending on the discipline and the specific university's policies. But each of those papers is part of that chapter 3. Chapter 3 does add to those papers by providing more of an introduction and a narrative linking each publication to the next, but really allows for each publication to contribute a component of the research design and study process. This is useful in many of the hard sciences because the outcome of an experiment will determine what is possible to conduct in the next experiment. In this case, in my case, chapter 1 informs a theoretical monograph first. That monograph takes the core ideas of postmodernism, of the meta-modern or post-postmodern ideas that are floating around and pulls them together to contextualize the remaining papers. Chapter 2, with that really overview of the methodological foundations, informs papers 1 through 5, so the actual research papers to come out of the dissertation. It gives the, again, broad overview of the methods used, whereas each of those individual papers has a section for the way that method was applied to the data set or to the particular topic. And then chapter 3, again, is that narrative and contextualization, providing the link between each of these seemingly separate papers and the rationale for why a paper format was or was not changed from proposal to final dissertation based on the results of the specific paper discussed. So that theoretical monograph will inform papers 1 through 5. It'll serve as that theoretical framework, or at least a theoretical overlay to a postmodern framework. Paper 1 will then inform directly papers 2, 3, and 4. and this will make more sense as we go through the research questions in the next couple of slides, but question 1 and research paper 1 really inform those papers, whereas paper 2 really directly informs papers 3 and 4, but again could not be done without the information gained in paper 1. Paper 4 then goes on to inform paper 5. Paper 5, rather than being a more standalone follow-up or next train in a theoretical framework, instead is a totally different track, but looking at, does software matter? So does the available resources, by proxy the financial resources needed to access certain software, lead to different outcomes of the research using the same data set and the same framework, the same procedures as papers 1 through 4. So paper 5 really does that reevaluation and contextualization of 1 to 4 as saying, does price play a factor? So these research questions, they are all around campus diversity and researcher productivity. Because I am arguing in this proposal and in the ultimate dissertation that identity is not fixed, and the ideas of the past identity formation, so conceptual frameworks like critical race theory, current queer theory, current postmodernism, really don't serve the millennial and postmillennial Gen Z generations, because they grew up in a time of interconnectivity and significant cultural change. There's a fundamental shift from being an identity or identifying in a specific way to having an intersectional identity formation, where an identity doesn't fit into specific boxes, or where at least an individual's identity doesn't fit into boxes, and instead is much more fluid and much more malleable. So this theoretical formation really addresses the question of, can a postmodern, or metamodern theoretical framework be developed using queer theory to conceptualize that postmillennial identity formation and the modern way intersectionality is seen in this population. There are many pieces on education and millennials, and we're getting more pieces on job and employment statuses and millennials. So there's already a shift in the way we think about managing millennials or teaching millennials and Gen Z. And so this theoretical framework will really build off of that and show how the post-millennial experience is fundamentally different, and therefore the way we conduct this research needs to be formed in a different manner. So that theoretical framework will inform the first paper, which has the first research question: can existing indices of campus demographic diversity be expanded to include intersecting identities and the broader campus community? This work was kind of started by Chang and Yamamoto, who published a diversity index that's still in use by US News and World Report. However, that is very limited in its application and what identities are respected and referenced in that calculation. So the first paper asks, can we expand that to include issues like economic diversity, religious diversity, gender diversity, any of those other data points that might give us a more inclusive representation of campus diversity. Research question 2 asks, ultimately, can those recalculated campus diversity indices be related to scientific creativity and productivity? Creativity is the proportion of the publications that an institution generated, or that individuals affiliated with that institution generated, in the top 80 hard science journals And these are indexed by the Nature Index, provided in some of the supplemental resources linked in the description of this video. That question of does creativity relate to diversity will really be an inverse relationship. The assumption is that more diversity results in more collaboration and thus a smaller share of the citations that an individual receives because they are on a multi-author, multi-institution paper rather than being on a monograph or a single institution paper. Productivity, on the other hand, is measured by just the raw count of the publications an institution has or researchers are affiliated with the institution have in those top 80 Nature Index journals. So research question 2 will pull from research question 1 to get that diversity indices, but then relate it to these Nature Index variables. Research question 3, thus paper 3, does local and regional diversity impact the relationship that is seen between diversity and scientific creativity and productivity? So from research question 2 and the indices developed in research question 1, does broadening those to the general community around a campus, so not only faculty, students, and staff on campus, but the zip code tabulation area, the county, the city demographics, any of those different levels of geographic distribution, applying a more campus ecology framework to think of the campus as a part of a broader regional community. And does that diversity impact campus? Because obviously professors and many students are not locked within the campus or do not only exist within the campus. They go off campus, they live off campus, and thus they are having more interaction with diversity of the general public. Research question 4, thus paper 4, do campus demographic indices function as a measurement tool for a latent trait or latent construct of campus diversity? This takes that theoretical framework and the idea that post-millennial identity formation is much more fluid and not directly observable or measurable by things like race and ethnicity categories, and really asks, okay, even though we don't know all of that diversity that is factoring in here, can we approximate it? Can we use all of these variables from papers 1 through 3 to construct a measurement model? And all of those will be included in a subsequent slide. There's a draft of those measurement models available, linked in the draft of the dissertation proposal in the description of this video. The last research question and the last research paper branches off of the idea of economic diversity. It's asking if open source and closed source software function identically to paid programs. If not, does the program selected affect the research outcomes and interpretations? So all paper 5 is doing is taking the methods applied in papers 1 through 4, analyzing the data in different programs and seeing if in that process decisions that were made in papers 1 through 4 would have come out differently, essentially taking the statistical analyses and treating those as individual data points. So for instance, the mean of a given indices or given index, is that identical when that index is recalculated in, say, Google Sheets versus Microsoft Excel versus IBM's SPSS versus Statistica versus Stata versus R, so on and so forth. So that's kind of why research question 5 is pulled separately, but does follow from the results of papers 1 through 4.